Welcome to section 9.6, day 1, polar coordinates. We're going to be plotting points and finding multiple representation of points in the polar coordinate system. So before we get to the polar coordinate system, let's just do a brief review of the rectangular system, which is the one that you are familiar with. So the rectangular coordinate system has an x-axis and has a y-axis, and to locate a point you will move left and right, or horizontal on the x-axis, and up and down or vertical on the y-axis. And so when you plot a point, every point is unique and it has a direction based on positive and negative. With the polar coordinate system, it's a little different. You have what looks to be the x-axis, but it's called the polar axis. So it's not the x-axis, but it is in comparison to the x-axis, but it's called the polar axis. And we don't actually have a y-axis on the polar coordinate system. We have the pole, which represents the origin of the rectangular, so this would be called the origin at 0, 0, but in polar it's called the pole. And then how we name a point, instead of doing x, y, you have r comma theta. R represents the distance from the pole to that location or that point. And then theta is the angle that is formed from the polar axis to the ray that is formed in terms of that point or that location. So once again, instead of x, y, we're now going to have r comma theta, and that's called a polar coordinate. R is the distance from the pole to the point, which I just mentioned. And then theta is the angle, can be in degrees or radians, where it's formed by the polar axis and ray from pole through that point. So those are going to be our two values that we're going to use to indicate where a point is located on the polar coordinate system. Alright, let's now take a look at plotting some of these points. So the first thing you notice is it's not a rectangular coordinate. We now have circles, and that's going to help us with the angles and the distance away from the pole. So this is 1 unit, 2 units, 3 units, 4 units, and so on. And then these lines from the pole, these are going to represent your angles. And so what are they going to be? Well, we still know this is pi over 2. This represents pi, 3 pi over 2, and this starts at 0. And then each one is going to represent 15 degrees. So 15, 30, 45, 60, 75, and 90. So this will be pi over 6, pi over 4, pi over 3, 75 degrees, but once again we're probably not going to be using those much. We'll stick with our 30, 45s, and 60s. So now if we want to plot the, point A is 2 comma pi. Pi is 1/2 of a rotation, and it's 2 units on the away from the pole. So 2 units away from the pole, we have 1, 2. So that would be 2. Remember, this is not rectangular, so that is not a negative value. It's the angle and then the units away from the pole. So once again, the angle, which is pi, and then 2 units away from the pole. So this would represent point A. Point B is 3 comma 5 pi over 4. So we got pi over 4. This would be 3 pi over 4. And this would be 5 pi over 4. So 5 pi over 4 from the polar axis to that angle. And then 3 units. 1, 2, 3. So this would represent point B. So now go ahead and try to plot point C on your own. It has an R value of 3 and an angle of negative 3 pi over 4. So you think of the angle, negative 3 pi over 4, so that'd be going in this direction. And then 3 units. So this still represents negative 3 pi over 4. It's that direction that you're going with the angle, and then 3 circles out, or a distance of 3 out. So that would be, once again, 1, 2, 3, and it happens to fall on the same point as B does. So you can see in polar coordinate form, not every point is distinct. You can name points using different angles, which we see right here, but yet they're still the same location. Point D has a negative r value. So we haven't talked about the negative r value just yet, but let's take a look down here. It says if r is negative, the point is on a ray in the opposite direction of that side. So instead of plotting the point in the positive direction, we go in the negative direction, or the opposite direction is what I should say, the opposite direction of that. So that's pi units away. So if we're looking at negative 2 comma 2 pi over 3, where's 2 pi over 3 located? So that would be in quadrant 2. And then that would be from here to here. And if we did 2, it would be 1, 2. So it'd be right here. But it's in the opposite direction of 2 pi over 3. So that would be going this way. Alright, so we would go 2 units, 1, 2, and that point would fall right there. So it's in the opposite direction. So once again, 1, 2 units, this would represent the point D. So once again, the r value, if it is negative, you go in the opposite direction of the terminal side of theta. So look at point E. Point E is negative 3 and negative 5 pi over 6. So we got a negative angle. So negative 5 pi over 6 would be right here. Okay. And then we want to go in the opposite direction 3 units. So in the opposite direction, be 1, 2, 3 units. And so E would fall right there. So once again, to explain that, negative 5 pi over 6 would be all the way right here. We go in the opposite direction, 3 units, 1, 2, 3, and so point E would end up in quadrant 1. So that's how we plot points in polar form. Now let's take a look at this representation. So polar coordinates, as we found out, are not unique like they are in rectangular form. R comma theta, so if you pick a point, and we'll pick the point, let's do 4 pi over 3. So that would be pi over 3 right here. And then 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So let's just pick this point as a reference. So the ordered pair 4 comma pi over 3 represents a point. But if we add 2 pi, 1 full rotation, we'll get another angle that represents the exact same point. So pi over 3 plus 2 pi represents 4 comma, that'd be 7 pi over 3. So if we plotted 4 comma pi over 3 or 4 comma 7 pi over 3, it's the same location. Or we could also take pi over 3 and go the other way and subtract 2 pi. And then that would give us 4 comma. So now we would be going in the other direction for this one. And that would look like, lost my point, 1, 2, 3, 4. So now we would go in the negative direction and rotate this way around. And so we'd subtract 2 pi, and if we subtract 2 pi, that would give us negative 5 pi over 3. So all 3 of those points are the same representation. Now if we want to change the r value to a negative, we would only add and subtract pi because it goes in the opposite direction. So if I wanted to do negative 4, I would take pi over 3 and add pi or subtract pi. So if I added pi, that would be negative 4 comma 4 pi over 3. Or if I subtracted pi, that would leave me with negative 4, negative 2 pi over 3. So are these the only points that we could use to label that point? No. We can do multiple rotations. We could add 2 multiple times. We could add pi multiple times in terms of the negative r. So we have to, well, not add pi multiple times, I shouldn't say it that way, but we'd have to make sure that that rotation fell in the opposite direction. But there's multiple ways to name one single point. So in rectangular form, it's unique, each point is unique, but in polar form, there are multiple ways to name a single point. So let's plot the point 3 pi over 6. So here's pi over 6. And then 3 units out, 1, 2, 3. So we'll just call this point P. I want you to find 3 additional representations, anything between the angle negative 2 pi and 2 pi. So we have a couple options. We can take the angle pi over 6 and add or subtract 2 pi. But if you think about it, if I add 2 pi to this, that's going to put me over 2 pi. So we don't want to add 2 pi on this one. We would want to subtract 2 pi. So we will subtract 2 pi to get the new point 3 comma negative 11 pi over 6, which is still within that range. How can we do another point? Well, we could do the opposite of r, which would be negative 3. So we would want this one to fall in the opposite direction, which would be this angle right here. If we start at 0 and go all the way around, that would be your 7 pi over 6. So we could say negative 3 comma pi over 6 plus pi, which would be 7 pi over 6. And that's still within the negative 2 pi to 2 pi. And if we need a third representation, we could do the same thing, but if we take pi over 6 and subtract pi, that would give us negative 5 pi over 6. And so those are 3 more additional ways to represent the same exact point, 3 comma pi over 6. So go ahead and pause the video and try to plot the point negative 2 comma negative 3 pi over 4 and give 3 additional representations of that same point where your theta is between negative 2 pi and 2 pi. Alright, so hopefully you took the opportunity to pause the video and work through this. When you plot the point negative 2 comma negative 3 pi over 4, this is the direction, the opposite direction. We're going to clockwise from the polar axis, but the negative 2 is going to go in the opposite direction. So we're going to have the point P in that quadrant 1, 2 units away from the pole. So what are 3 other ways that you can do this? Well, since the r value is negative 2 on this example, you would add 2 pi or subtract 2 pi to get another angle. So I took negative 3 pi over 4 plus 2 pi to get negative 2, 5 pi over 4. Think about it. 5 pi over 4 would be right here. The negative 2 goes 2 units from the pole in the opposite direction. We can't do any more negatives because if we subtracted 2 pi, it would put us outside that range. So we go to positive 2. So now we're going to only add pi. So negative 3 pi over 4 plus pi is 2 comma pi over 4. And negative 3 pi over 4 minus pi will keep us just inside that range at negative 7 pi over 4. So if you plot, once again, negative 7 pi over 4 is in the clockwise direction, and then 2 units there. So you can double check the points to make sure that you did write them down correctly, but if you plot each individual one of these, they will all be located at the same spot on the polar axis. Not the polar axis, but the polar coordinate. Alright, so that is it for the day 1. Once again, really introduction to what a polar coordinate is, understanding how to graph and rename points on the polar coordinate system. So write those important things down from this section.